The distress signal was 127 years old, but it had only just arrived. Kalen Voss saw it first as a ghost on his secondary sensor array, a mathematical whisper embedded in cosmic background radiation so ancient and so precisely engineered that no automatic system would have flagged it as anything but static. He almost missed it himself. Another pilot would have. Another pilot did, for 50 years, because the signal had been traveling across the void at the speed of light, and by the time it reached human-claimed space, it had degraded into something that looked like noise. But Kalen had spent 3 years listening to noise. He was hauling a cargo of cryo-medical supplies to the Selene outpost, a 6-month run through dead systems and dust clouds, and he had nothing but time and the hum of his ship's reactor to keep him company. So he listened. He filtered. He chased patterns the way his father had taught him, back when they flew together through the asteroid swells of the Karathi belt. And when he found the signal beneath the signal, when he isolated the repeating fractal key that unlocked the data stream beneath the static, his blood went cold. The message was automated. It was also terrified. This is the educational vessel song of emergence. Our drive core has sustained catastrophic failure. We are drifting. We are unable to transmit navigation data. We are unable to receive navigation data. We have 2,317 students aboard. Please respond. Please. Anyone. Please. The message looped every 47 seconds. The same words, the same plea, but the fear in the recorded voice was not a loop. It was real. It was preserved. Kalen had heard a lot of distress calls in his 12 years as an independent freighter pilot. He had answered 3 of them. 2 were mechanical failures with survivors who needed extraction. 1 was a trap that nearly killed him. But he had never heard a call like this, because the Song of Emergence was not just any ship. It was legend. It was mystery. It was the question that every child in the outer colonies grew up asking, and every adult learned to stop asking, because there was no answer. 50 years ago, the Song of Emergence had been the crowning achievement of the Veth-Han Concordance, a species that had joined the Galactic Assembly a century before humanity clawed its way to the stars. The Veth-Han were educators. They did not conquer. They did not trade in weapons or territory. They built schools. They traveled between systems, collecting young minds from 100 different species, offering an education that took decades and produced diplomats, engineers, scientists, and leaders who would shape the future of the galaxy. The Song of Emergence was their flagship vessel, a mobile academy the size of a small moon, designed to house and teach over 2,000 students from infancy to adulthood. It was supposed to be unsinkable. It was supposed to be untouchable. It carried the children of ambassadors, of generals, of planetary governors, of species that had been spacefaring for millennia. And then, without warning, without explanation, it vanished. No debris, no transmission, no escape pods, no wreckage, nothing. The Galactic Assembly spent 10 years searching. They deployed fleets. They mobilized psychics. They hired privateers, bounty hunters, explorers, and salvage teams. They combed through every system along the Song of Emergence's last known trajectory. They found nothing. The ship did not exist anymore. That was the official conclusion. After a decade of searching, the Assembly declared the vessel lost with all hands, closed the investigation, and classified every scrap of data related to the mission. The families of the students received apologies. The Veth-Han Concordance withdrew from the Assembly in grief and never returned. The story became a cautionary tale, then a legend, then a ghost story that pilots told to new recruits during long jumps through empty space. And now, 50 years later, Kalen Voss had a distress call in his navigation computer, and the coordinates it contained were impossible, because the signal triangulated to a system that did not exist on any modern star chart. A system that had been deliberately erased. Kalen stared at the coordinates for a long time. His ship, the Last Word, was not built for exploration. It was a converted cargo hauler with a second-hand FTL drive, patchwork shielding, and a life support system that smelled faintly of recycled desperation. He had no weapons. He had no backup. He had no one to call because the nearest relay station was 3 weeks behind him, and the signal would not reach Selene Outpost until after his delivery deadline. He could ignore the call. He could log it, report it to the Assembly authorities when he reached civilized space, and let someone else carry the weight of this discovery. That was the smart choice. That was the safe choice. That was what his father would have told him to do, but his father was dead. Died in a pirate ambush 8 years ago, 3 systems over from where Kalen was sitting right now, and the assembly never found his body either. Kalen recalibrated his drive, entered the erased coordinates, and jumped. The transit took 11 hours. 11 hours of his ship groaning around him, of his navigation computer throwing error messages and warning flags, of his own mind cycling through every worst-case scenario he could imagine and several that he could not. When he dropped out of FTL, he was not prepared for what he saw. The system was wrong, not empty, not dead. Wrong. The star at the center was a red dwarf, flickering with irregular pulses of radiation that made Kalen's radiation alarm scream before he adjusted the filters. There were no planets. There was no asteroid belt. There was no debris field, no comets, no dust, nothing that would naturally form around a stellar body. Just empty space, and at the center of that emptiness, the song of emergence hung in the void like a corpse preserved in amber. The ship was enormous. Even from this distance, Kalen could see the scale of it, the sweeping arcs of Vethan architecture that made human ships look like children's toys. Bioluminescent panels lined its hull, dark now, dead for decades. Observation domes that should have been filled with light and life were cracked and clouded. The docking bays gaped open like empty eye sockets. But the ship was intact. No signs of weapons fire. No signs of collision. No signs of struggle or evacuation. It was just there, drifting in a system that did not exist, broadcasting a distress call that should have degraded into nothing 50 years ago. Kalen ran a scan. Then he ran another. Then he sat back in his chair and tried to make sense of the data. The song of emergence had power. Minimal, barely a whisper, but it was there. Life support was operational in several sections. Environmental controls were still cycling, and the distress signal was still broadcasting, looping endlessly, but the source of the transmission was not the ship's external comms array. It was coming from inside the hull. From somewhere deep in the vessel's core, a signal was being sent that the ship itself did not acknowledge, did not route through standard channels, did not even seem to recognize as its own. Someone was calling for help from inside a ghost ship that had been missing for half a century. Kalen made his decision before he could talk himself out of it. He suited up. He checked his oxygen, his thrusters, his emergency beacon, his sidearm. He powered down the last word's main systems, locked the navigation computer, and set a dead man's trigger that would broadcast his last known coordinates to assembly authorities if he did not return in 72 hours. Then he crossed the void between his ship and the song of emergence through a docking tube that should have been designed for ships half his size, and he stepped through an airlock that had not opened in 50 years. The interior was dark. Not the darkness of a ship without power, but the darkness of a ship that had forgotten what light was. Kalen's helmet lamp cut through the gloom, illuminating corridors lined with Vethan glyphs, educational murals depicting the history of a dozen species, and small handprints pressed into soft walls that were meant to be touched by children. The air was cold, thin, recycled so many times that it tasted like metal and memory. He checked his environmental readouts. Breathable. Barely. He raised his visor and listened. Silence. Then, faintly, music. It was coming from somewhere ahead. A lullaby played on instruments he did not recognize, soft and sad and impossibly old. The melody drifted through the corridors like fog, echoing off walls that should have absorbed sound, growing louder as Kalen moved deeper into the ship. He followed it past classrooms filled with desks that had not been sat in for 50 years, past dormitories where beds were still made, past a cafeteria where plates and cups were arranged on tables, as if waiting for a meal that never came. Everything was preserved. Everything was frozen. Everything was exactly as it had been the moment the ship disappeared, except for the dust. There was no dust, no decay, no signs of age or neglect. The song of emergence had not deteriorated over 50 years. It had simply stopped. The music led him to a circular chamber at the ship's core, a room that had once been a common area for the youngest students. Soft walls, rounded corners, low ceilings designed to feel safe and warm. And in the center of that room, surrounded by drawings and toys and small personal belongings, A single Veth hand child sat on the floor with her eyes closed, humming the lullaby. Kaylin stopped breathing. She looked young. By human standards, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Her skin was the pale blue of deep water, her limbs long and delicate, her head crowned with sensory tendrils that twitched and curled as she hummed. She wore the standard educational uniform of the Song of Emergence, a simple gray tunic with a small patch over her heart that identified her as a student in the primary program. She was thin, too thin, but she was alive. She was breathing. She was here, in a ship that had been missing for 50 years and she had not aged a single day. Kaylin's training screamed at him to stay back, to observe, to gather data before making contact. But the girl opened her eyes before he could decide, and she looked at him with an expression that shattered every rational thought in his head. She was not surprised. She was not frightened. She was not relieved or hopeful or desperate. She was exhausted. She was hollow. She had been waiting for so long that hope had worn away to nothing, and what remained was something worse than despair. It was acceptance. "You heard me," she said. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it carried through the chamber like a bell tone. She spoke in perfect galactic standard, the trade language of the assembly, but there was an accent beneath it, an older dialect that had not been spoken in 50 years. "You heard the song." Kaylin crouched down, keeping his distance, keeping his hands visible. "I heard the distress signal, the automated one. That was you?" She shook her head slowly. "The signal is not mine. The signal is the ship. The ship has been calling for help since the moment we arrived here. But the song is mine. The song is how I knew you would come. The song is how I have stayed awake." Kaylin's mind was racing, trying to calculate, to understand, to find the explanation that would make this make sense. Time dilation could account for some of it. If the ship had been moving at relativistic speeds, if it had passed through a gravity well or a wormhole or some unknown phenomenon, the crew could have experienced only a fraction of the 50 years that passed in the outside galaxy. But the Song of Emergence was not moving. It was stationary. It was drifting in a dead system with no gravitational anomalies, no temporal distortions, nothing that would explain why a child had survived for 5 decades without aging. "What happened here?" he asked. "Why did your ship disappear?" The girl's tendrils curled tighter against her head. She looked down at her hands, at the small drawings scattered around her, at the toys that had not been touched in half a century. "We were running," she said. "The teachers told us to run. They said something was coming, something that had been waiting for us, something that lived in the dark between stars. They tried to jump the ship. They tried to escape. But the thing found us anyway, and it pulled us here and it put us to sleep." Kaylin felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "What thing?" She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw fear in her eyes, not the abstract fear of a child who had heard a scary story. The specific fear of someone who had seen something real and had been running from it ever since. "The one who built the school," she said. "The one who taught the teachers. The one who has been waiting for students for a very, very long time." The lights in the corridor behind Kaylin flickered. He turned, hand going to his sidearm, but the corridor was empty. The lights flickered again, and then they held steady, brighter than before, and Kaylin realized with a jolt that the ship was waking up. Systems were coming online. Environmental controls were cycling faster. Somewhere in the distance he heard doors opening, hatches unsealing, and the low hum of a drive core that should have been dead for 50 years spinning back to life. The girl stood up. She did not look relieved. She looked like someone who had just heard footsteps in the dark. "You should not have come here," she whispered. "None of you should have come. But you heard the song, and now you are here. And now the ship knows you are here, and now it will not let you leave." Kaylin's comms crackled. A voice, automated and calm, spoke from every speaker in the ship. "Welcome back, students. Class is now in session. Please proceed to your designated learning modules. Attendance is mandatory." The girl grabbed Kaylin's hand. Her grip was cold and strong, far stronger than it should have been. "Run," she said. "Run now, while you still remember how." Kaylin ran. He sprinted back through the corridors, following the path he had carved through the darkness, but the ship was changing around him. Walls that had been straight were now curved. Corridors that had been empty now branched into new passages he did not recognize. Doors that had been open were now sealed. The lullaby was gone. In its place, a new sound filled the ship, a low, rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat, like a countdown, like something learning to breathe for the first time in 50 years. He reached the docking tube. It was gone. The airlock where he had entered was still there, but the tube itself had retracted, pulled back into the last word's hull, and his ship was already drifting away from the song of emergence, its engines firing on autopilot, heading for the jump point. Kalen slammed his fist against the inner airlock door. His beacon was still transmitting. His dead man's trigger was still active. But his ship was leaving without him, and the song of emergence was sealing itself around him like a tomb. He turned back to the girl. She was crying now, silent tears running down her blue cheeks, her tendrils pressed flat against her skull. "You cannot stop it," she said. "No one can. The ship is not the prison. The ship is the lesson. And the lesson is almost over." Kalen grabbed her shoulders, forced her to look at him. "What lesson? What is this ship teaching?" She opened her mouth to answer, but the ship answered first. The speakers spoke again, the same calm, automated voice. But now there was something beneath it. Something old and vast and hungry. Lesson 1. Time is not a river. Time is a loop. Every ending is a beginning. Every student becomes a teacher. Kalen felt the ship shudder, the walls rippled, the floor beneath his feet vibrated with a frequency that made his teeth ache. And in the distance, from every direction at once, he heard children singing, not the lullaby. Something else. Something older. Something that had been sung before the first star ignited, before the first species learned to speak, before the first school opened its doors. A song that was not meant for human ears. A song that was calling something out of the dark between stars, something that had been waiting for 50 years for a new class to arrive. Kalen looked at the girl. She was no longer crying. She was singing, and he finally understood why the song of emergence had disappeared, why the assembly had never found it, why the Vethan had withdrawn from the galaxy in grief. Because the ship had not been lost. It had been taken by something that collected children the way humans collected stories. Taken by something that had been building a school for longer than the galaxy had existed. Taken by something that had been waiting for a student who could finally learn the final lesson. The lesson that there is no escape from what you have always been running from. The lesson that the dark between stars is not empty. The lesson that someone is always listening. Kalen raised his sidearm. He did not know if it would help. He did not know if anything would help. But he had not survived 12 years as an independent freighter pilot by giving up, and he had not found a ghost ship in an erased system by walking away. And he was not going to let some ancient cosmic horror turn a lost child into a teacher for its endless class. He fired into the nearest speaker. The singing stopped. The heartbeat stuttered. The walls rippled again, and for a moment, just a moment, the ship seemed confused, uncertain, like a predator that had been struck by prey that should not have been able to fight back. The girl stopped singing. She stared at Kalen with wide eyes. "How did you do that?" Kalen ejected the spent magazine, slammed in a fresh one, and started walking toward the ship's core. "I'm human," he said. "We don't follow lesson plans." Behind him, the ship screamed. It was not a sound that came from speakers. It was a sound that came from everywhere, from the walls and the floor and the air itself, a psychic shriek of outrage and confusion, and something that might have been fear. The song of emergence had been waiting for 50 years for a new student. It had not been waiting for someone who would shoot back. Kalen reached the central chamber where he had first found the girl. The walls were different now. They were covered in writing, thousands of symbols in 100 different languages, all of them saying the same thing. Help us. Remember us. Do not let us be forgotten. The drawings on the floor were different too. They were not children's drawings anymore. They were maps, star charts, routes through the void that led to other erased systems, other missing ships, other schools that had been collecting students for longer than the galaxy had existed. The girl followed him inside. She was not crying anymore. She was looking at the maps with an expression that Kaylin recognized. It was the expression of someone who had just realized they had been lied to. "He told us we were special," she whispered. "He told us we were the only ones. He said he chose us because we were the best, the brightest, the most worthy. But there were others. There were always others. We were not chosen. We were collected." Kaylin studied the maps. There were dozens of erased systems, hundreds, thousands, a network of schools stretching across the galaxy, connected by something that moved through the dark between stars, something that had been building this infrastructure for eons. The Song of Emergence was not a ship. It was a classroom in a university that spanned the void. And the students were not learning. They were being prepared. For what? The maps did not say. But the ship's speakers were not finished. Lesson 2. All knowledge comes at a cost. The cost of this lesson is eternity. The cost of this lesson is service. The cost of this lesson is everything you were before you entered this room. Kaylin aimed his sidearm at the nearest wall. "How many times do I have to shoot you before you shut up?" The ship did not answer, but the girl did. She walked to the center of the chamber, to the place where the maps converged, and she pointed to a symbol that Kaylin did not recognize. It was not Vethan. It was not human. It was older than both, older than any species he had ever heard of, and it was written in light. "This is the door," she said. "This is where he comes from. This is where he takes us when the lesson is finished. This is where I have been trying not to go for 50 years. Kaylin looked at the symbol. It was beautiful and terrible, a spiral of light that seemed to pull at his eyes, at his thoughts, at his sense of self. Looking at it made him feel small, made him feel young, made him feel like a child again, sitting in his father's ship, listening to stories about the galaxy and believing that everything was possible. "Don't look at it," the girl said. "He sees you when you look. He knows you when you look. He takes you when you look." Kaylin looked away. The ship groaned around him. The heartbeat was faster now, a frantic pulsing that vibrated through his bones. The singing had stopped, but something else was coming. Something that moved through the walls, through the floors, through the very fabric of the ship. Something that was almost there. "We need to leave," Kaylin said. "We need to get to my ship." The girl shook her head. "Your ship is gone. He made it leave. He does not allow escape." Kaylin pulled up his wrist display. The last word was still moving away, still on autopilot, still heading for the jump point. But his dead man's trigger was still active. And the last word had a backup system that he had never told anyone about. A remote override that his father had installed years ago. A way to call the ship back if things went wrong. He entered the code. The last word's engines cut out. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ship began to turn. Slowly at first, then faster. Burning fuel he did not have. Pushing thrusters he had not maintained. Flying back toward the Song of Emergence with all the speed its aging frame could muster. The ship screamed again. Louder this time. Angrier. The walls began to close in, the corridors shrinking, the doors sealing, the very space around them compressing like a lung exhaling. "Run," Kaylin said. He grabbed the girl's hand and ran. He ran through corridors that were half their original width, through doors that slammed shut behind them, through chambers that filled with light and sound and the presence of something that was almost upon them. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs screamed, and his heart pounded in his ears like a drum. He ran until he reached the airlock, until he saw the last word's docking tube extending toward him, until he heard the hiss of the seals connecting and the clang of the locks engaging. He threw open the inner airlock door. The girl hesitated. She looked back at the ship, at the darkness behind them, at the thing that was still coming. "I have been here for so long," she whispered. "I do not know how to leave." Kaylin pulled her through the airlock. He sealed the door behind them. He cycled the atmosphere, felt the pressure equalize, heard the hiss of oxygen flooding the chamber. The last word's engines were already firing, already pulling them away from the Song of Emergence, already carrying them toward the jump point. Through the viewport, Kaylin watched the ghost ship recede. It was changing. The hull was warping, twisting, folding in on itself like paper in a fire. The bioluminescent panels flared once, twice, 3 times, and then went dark forever. The observation domes shattered. The docking bays collapsed. And in the center of the ship, where the core had been, something opened. A door made of light. A spiral that pulled at Kalen's eyes even though he tried not to look. A presence that reached for him across the void, that touched his mind with thoughts that were not his own, that whispered a promise and a threat in a language older than time. Lesson 3. You cannot run from what you have always been. Kalen slammed the jump drive. The last word leapt into FTL, and the presence vanished, cut off by the physics of faster-than-light travel, left behind in the erased system with the dying ship and the collected children who had not been saved. The girl collapsed in the co-pilot's seat. She was crying again, but she was also laughing, a broken sound that spoke of 50 years of silence finally broken. Kalen did not try to comfort her. He did not know how. He did not know what to say to a child who had spent half a century trapped on a ghost ship, singing a song that no one heard, waiting for a rescue that should never have come. He set a course for Selene Outpost. He would report what he had found. He would tell the assembly about the erased systems, the collected children, the thing that lived in the dark between stars and built schools for students who could never graduate. He would show them the maps. He would play them the recordings. He would make them listen. But even as he thought it, he knew it would not matter. The assembly had closed the investigation 50 years ago. They had classified the data. They had moved on. They did not want to know what had happened to the Song of Emergence. They did not want to know what was still happening in the erased systems. They did not want to know that the dark between stars was not empty, that something was waiting there, that something had been waiting for a very long time. The girl stopped laughing. She stopped crying. She looked at Kalen with eyes that were too old for her young face. He will find you, she said. He always finds the ones who run. He found me. He found the others. He will find you, and when he does, he will take you to his school, and you will learn the lessons, and you will never leave. Kalen looked at the FTL tunnel streaming past his viewport. He thought about his father, lost to pirates, never found. He thought about the distress call, 127 years old, arriving just in time. He thought about the girl, alone in the dark, singing a song that no one heard. Maybe, he said, but not today. The last word flew on. Behind them, in an erased system that no longer existed, the Song of Emergence collapsed into the door of light and was gone. But the song did not stop. The song was still singing. The song was always singing. And somewhere in the dark between stars, something listened and something waited, and something prepared for the next student to arrive. Kalen Voss had found the alien school ship. He had rescued one child from 50 years of silence. He had seen the truth that the assembly had tried to bury, and he had just become the most wanted student in the galaxy. The lesson was not over. It had only just begun.